When we're free to move, anything is possible.
How often have dark clouds rained on your plans after you worked on them for so long? And how often have you simply ignored them? When the wind kicks up its wild heels, do you bury your head over it? Or join in a carefree dance with it? Do obstacles in your way really stop you? Or do they just motivate you even more? And what do you listen to when you find yourself at a crossroads? Your heart? Protect those satisfying moments. And we'll protect the rest for you. Generali. We put satisfaction first.
When we're free to move, anything is possible.
Oh, thank you. All right, now it's on. Hooray. As we begin, I just want to remind everyone that the conversation extends beyond just the individuals on this panel and beyond the individuals in the room. We'll have a Q&A session where you're encouraged to ask questions to the panelists and contribute thoughts, and also to share thoughts and ideas online. If you are doing so, please use the hashtag BSF2019. so that other individuals who are at the event can follow along, and also so individuals who are following online but not at the event can participate. And if you haven't done so, please do be sure to download the Blood Strategic Forum app so that you can connect with other individuals at the event. So to go ahead and get started, this panel is Data, Resource of the Future. And big data is a term, if you're not familiar with it, that generally refers to the massive amounts of data and information that is accumulating as a result of new advances in science and technology. And thanks to advances in science, in data science and computer science, systems have given us the ability to make sense of this information, to analyze it and identify trends and use it to make actionable decisions. And in some senses, in some cases, these computer systems are guiding us in our decision making and making decisions for us. On today's panel, we're going to talk about data and the role that it has in the future of organizations, of society, and of governments, and the degree to which it is and is not fast becoming a resource of the future. We have a number of esteemed panelists today. The first we have is Sir Julian King, who was appointed EU Commissioner for the Security Union in 2016. He joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1985 and is a graduate of Oxford University and the École Nationale d'Administration in Paris. I do apologize for my awful French. Next we have Mr. Gregor Pilgrim, who is CFO of Generali Austria, CEE in the CE and Russia region, He is responsible for consolidation, controlling, actuarial services, bank assurance, and reassurance, and he supervises the financial performance and strategic development of 10 CEE countries out of the Generali CEE holding. Mr. Samir Sharma is the founder and CEO of DataZoom, which is a data strategy and analytics consultancy. He has 20 years' experience with a track record focusing on delivering data strategy and analytics programs. As a data translator, he acts as the bridge between technical and business departments, breaking down internal silos and providing a common language. Mr. Levente Juhas, who is down here, is a public policy manager at Google for Central and Eastern Europe. He leads on topics of digital transformation, economic contribution, and sustainability in the region. Prior to joining Google, he spent several years at Energy Midcap working on EU affairs, strategy, and innovation management. And Juhas, Mr. Juhas Settlebeer is the CEO of Ellis Company and has been employed by the Slovenian transmission system operator Ellis for more than 20 years. During this period, he has worked on internal, national, and international leverage management and coordination in the field of power systems, operations, electric markets, infrastructure projects, and technical information systems. He also helped to establish the Strategic Innovation Department that he is currently leading. So those are our panelists for today. And to get us started, Commissioner King is going to begin by giving some opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm just standing up because I've got a piece of paper here rather than have it flap around. So there's an awful amount of private sector and business expertise on the panel. That doesn't include me. So I guess I'm here to give a tiny bit of public administration, public policy perspective on this discussion. The European Commission, the European member states collectively, clearly see data as a resource of the future. Kind of obvious. But if we're going to get the best out of it, if we're going to be able to really draw the benefits of data for the future of our economy and our society, then we need trust. And getting that trust and maintaining that trust is and can be a challenge. It's not necessarily the technology. The technology itself is largely neutral. It's what you do with it. You can do good things with it, and I'm sure we're going to hear some really positive examples of the good that you can do by using data. But you can also have some bad effects. Unintended or bad actors can misuse and abuse data in ways that cause harm. Part of my job is to think about some of those bad things. So I don't want to give a gloomy perspective because I think that the risks can be managed and mitigated. But I do think you need to be open about the fact that there can be risks. And you do have to have a discussion about how you're going to manage and mitigate those risks, the potential downside, if you're going to maintain the trust you need to get all of the benefits. So I'm going to say very briefly 3 things that we worry about, that we think there are solutions to. The first is, how are you going to secure your data? How are you going to secure the plumbing that we use to gather and share data? How are you going to protect it when you've got it? Secondly, how are you going to make sure that data is used in a good way and not a bad way? It's not abused and misused. In particular, that links to a discussion some of us were having in another room earlier on about AI and how AI is going to work in its exploitation of data. And thirdly, specifically, how can we crack down on those bad actors who are seeking deliberately to misuse data, which can have problems in and of itself, but also undermines the fundamental social trust you need. So, in order, there's a challenge about securing our data. First of all, there's a challenge about securing the interconnectedness of our lives, the fundamental digital plumbing that we are becoming ever more dependent on, whether that is the Internet of Things or, subject that's under much discussion at the moment, 5G. We think you can do this, but you have to have an honest and open discussion. In Europe, slightly in contrast to the United States, and definitely in contrast to China, we are trying to build a shared approach to securing our 5G infrastructure that comes to a shared appreciation of the potential risks, and then a shared set of proposals for managing and mitigating those risks, so that you can show publicly and explain what you're doing to users that they can trust the plumbing that they're using to communicate and increasingly live their everyday lives. Also, we believe that we can set some standards through things like the GDPR, which you'll be familiar with, around protections of data, so that citizens, consumers, users, choose your term, can have some confidence that if they have given some sort of consent and their data has been collected, it's not going to be raided by others who haven't got permission to use it. Those are some of the building blocks that we think you need if you're going to have some basic protections around the collection and the holding of data. But then there's the question of how is that data used? How are you going to demonstrate that we are protecting rather than undermining the core values, the way we live our lives, values on which our societies are founded, through the way data is not only collected but then used? And again, we think that you need to have an open debate about that. Because I work in the Commission, I'm sometimes accused in forums like this of loving regulation. I don't love regulation. I'm a Brit. I'm very skeptical about regulation. I do think that you sometimes need rules. Those rules don't necessarily have to be in legislation or regulation. They can be norms. They can be voluntary rules as long as they have some credibility. But in this field, about the use of mass data, including through its exploitation using AI, I think we definitely need some rules which will give confidence. We need rules around human oversight. We need rules around transparency and accountability, so that if you think there's a problem, you can ask for an explanation and, if necessary, get a redress, as well as rules around privacy and data protection so that, again, you have some faith in the fact that your data is not being used against you without your consent or knowledge. And lastly, thirdly, we have to face up to the fact that while there's lots of good, there are some bad actors who are deliberately seeking to misuse data against us. One of the things that I've been working on is how to tackle the problems of disinformation and intervention in political space, in our political debates and our political processes. This is it's not going away, and in some ways it's getting harder. But we have managed to promote some better cooperation between like-minded countries to try and map this problem and work together to deal with it. We are promoting debate in civil society and some longer-term measures around media plurality and diversity and education and awareness of the issue, awareness being one of the best ways of closing down the space in which bad actors can act against us. But we also, and that's where I'm going to finish, rely crucially on cooperation with the private sector. I mean, that applies to all of this, but it particularly applies to closing down the space for bad actors. For example, those seeking to use disinformation, political disinformation, to tilt or disrupt our political debate. We, in Europe, slightly ahead of the United States on this, have done an international first, which is agree a code of practice on disinformation with the big social media platforms, and I salute those social media platforms who signed up to this. It's voluntary. It sets some rules which we're going to try and apply to boost transparency. So this isn't about saying whether a particular piece of political content is good or bad, right or wrong. That is the slippery slope to censorship. It is about saying if you're being presented with information and data, if data is being used to send information to you, to target you, you should be able to know about that. It should be transparent. You should be able to interrogate that data, know why it's coming to you, and know where it's coming from. There's still a long way to go on that, but with the help of Google, Twitter, Facebook, and others, we are making some progress. I think it's really essential that we address these subjects because if we don't, as I say, you risk undermining trust, which is essential to getting all the benefits. I'm very glad that the incoming Commission, because I'm on the way out, are going to keep these subjects as priority subjects. I'm very glad that the incoming President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has already made clear that she's going to put forward legislation for a coordinated European approach on human and ethical implications of the use of AI very early in her term. I think that's really important. And she's also proposed a new Digital Services Act, which is going to upgrade questions around liability and safety rules for digital platforms, services, and products. This isn't to interfere. This isn't to cause trouble. It's to build and maintain trust.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So there are a lot of topics that were obviously covered, and some of those we're going to address today. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to address all of them. But I think one of the most critical points, which is also the name of this panel, Data Resource of the Future, is to what degree is data actually a resource of the future? And critically, if it is, what does that mean for nations who don't have access or resources to make use of that data? Levente, if you would like to get us started, you work at Google, so it seems relevant for you to sort of lead us. How is data, figured? Is it the resource of the future?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us here today. Data is, of course, very important. It is at the foundation of what we call the data economy, and we also always like to say that all companies are digital today. They all rely on data of some sort, in some way, shape, or form. We also think that sometimes its importance is misconstrued, and I've been transparent about having a background in the energy sector, and there is one I think oft-used metaphor that I think might be leading us down on a wrong path, which is the adage that data is the new oil. We can see how that is on the surface carrying some similarities, that maybe data mining and drilling for oil might be conceptually similar, but we also think that it's fundamentally flawed insofar as data is abundant, it is not scarce. It can be shared and reused indefinitely. Its quality does not diminish if it is reused or reshared. More than one entity can own a single piece of data. And maybe that's useful to start off on a good framing. That is not to say that there is not something true to that. I mean, if we want to stick to the oil and gas analogy, then I might argue that we should rather look at the refinery as an analogy of what the data economy is, because that is where the real value is added, in that sector and also in our sector, and that is to say the algorithms. So it is a recipe, not so much the individual ingredients, and you have to look at the entire set. That there is a lot of research, both fundamental and applied research, that goes into some fundamental insights about what might work, and then there is a lot of engineering going into turning that idea or insight into a product that then will be used by hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of people. I think today we have 8 or 9 products that are used by more than 1 billion people. That is a tremendous responsibility and a tremendous vote of confidence in those products. So I find myself in agreement with the Commissioner when he outlined that the fundamentals of the data economy, or the fundamental, is trust. That is based on, I think, privacy on the one hand and security on the other, and I'm sure we will be able to touch upon that, but this is perhaps our perspective on that, briefly.
And then also, sorry, so just to sum what you said, so rather than seeing data as oil as something that is owned, it is something that we all own in a variety of capacities and share. And then, Samir, I know that you have some thoughts about data and how it is seen and perceived in society, and perhaps also to get us started, could you perhaps clarify how you see data and our assessment of it? Do we, as a society, have a good understanding of data, or are we too pessimistic or optimistic? Do we really understand its uses?
Yes, it's a good question. I think we're at a bit of a crossroads because we've had data around for a long time. It's not a new thing to us. The scale of it has just increased. We've become more open to using platforms that we provide our own data to. And, you know, we are quite willing to give our data away. There is a value exchange there that often it's a quid pro quo, that we will provide our data, our personal details in some ways, shape or form, to get that value of being connected. And those people are, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles away, because our families are, you know, the world is now much smaller in terms of the connectivity, but these platforms have made it easier for us to respond to people instantly. And I think now we are working and living in a world where data is the fabric of what we do every day. We log on to our Facebook, we log on to our Twitter, we log on to our LinkedIn, we log on to our systems at work. Our data is, you know, this device that we carry around on a daily basis can track us anywhere we go. So I think we've given away quite a lot of our personal details. And there I think that goes back to the point that Commissioner King made about trust. We've seen all the scandals, we've seen the bad actors, we've seen the immense actions that have been undertaken to use our data for bad. But I think that's a very small majority. Most of us want to do good. We want to use that data for purposes of enriching society, of providing different products and services to society. And I think that's where we're moving towards. And I believe that crossroads is between the private sector and government now, where we need to start to think about how we can tap into this thing. And I agree with Levante, it's not the new oil as such. Some people call it the new bacon, some people call it the new avocado. But it actually is, you know, something that we really need to understand and what it can do for our lives. Not just the fact that we give it away, but that value exchange is important because we're asking for services back. And I think we need to, as citizens, as employees, as people of the world, need to try and take back some of that control of our data. And that's the one thing I think that people, probably people in this room understand, but generally not everybody does. And giving away data is a very seamless, easy thing to do. But we've got to be very careful because there's a lot of people who don't understand what happens with it. And it's not used for bad all the time. I think we've got very small instances of it. You know, and I'll give you an example where we're currently working with a very large housing organization in the UK to build and design houses of the future using data for people with mental health problems. So that's a good thing that we're doing with data. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be the bad actors of society. So I think the trust is there. There was a recent poll done across the world, and I can't remember if it was done by Google or Facebook, but 71% of the people who were surveyed actually said they didn't mind giving their data away if there was something that they were going to get back. So I think there is already that exchange and that value and trust. It's just these small things that happen with some companies that have tarnished that element of trust, and that's what we've got to win back.
And so we talked about a lot of things.
Yeah.
There's trust, the need for individuals to have power, for governments to work alongside the private sector in a way that benefits us all. So I suppose it makes sense to start diving into some of those questions. What are the things that we need in order to ensure that data benefits society and organizations, both profit and purpose? And ultimately, how do we go about securing those things? Now, that last component we might not be able to dive into or have the exact answers for, but in any way we could reach for that, that would be great. Urhos, and I know I'm pronouncing your name wrong, so please feel free to correct me. You work in the infrastructure sector, so I know that you probably have some thoughts about this in relation to ensuring that data is actually able to benefit us and we're able to use it effectively.
Actually, yes. I come from a power transmission company. So the power transformation, the power system transformation actually becomes the core essence of our existence. And of course, the main motive there for the user is the decarbonization, which we all know about. We know what are the targets. But I think in the background, there is an important element which general public also perceives as a goal, which is the freedom of choice, actually. We don't like these big utility companies. We want to get rid of them. We want to become independent. And this becomes one of the drivers of our power system transformation. So I will maybe start talking about the use of data in a decentralized way, because that seems to be one of the motivations. What people tend to do is they try to go into democratization. They try to build their own devices. You put your solar, you buy an electric vehicle, you try to combine them in a certain way. And of course, when you go far enough in this process, you want to use the data to collaborate, to exchange your data with your peers, or to find a way through. And then comes this problem, which I don't think we talked about yet, the actual freedom of choice, the problem of actual freedom of choice. Because it's similar to search engines or similar things, you know. You get the data to make decisions, but the question is, did your decision really come from the transparent data, and did you really make the real freedom of choice? Or did you make your choice, you thought it was free, but it was just diluted because the data was not correct. And this comes really to the core essence of the power system transformation, as I explained. But there's another point, of course, on the power system transformation point, where we don't look only for the decentralized use of data. We also need to take care for this traditional centralized use of data, because there is a vast amount of data collected now at the data points, the data hubs, and you can use this data to enable better coping with intermittencies coming from renewable sources. We can actually optimize the system in much better way today if we use this data properly. We can make better electrification, which is an important element of power transmission. And we can also reduce operational risk, increase efficiency, and something. So data can be used in different ways, but the freedom of choice as one of the elements I find very important for this panel.
So individuals.
Yeah.
So individuals having like the freedom to say what happens with their data, to make decisions using that. Yes. Samir, you're shaking your head and agreeing a lot. Did you?
I was just violently agreeing, really. Yeah, I think it's very important that we have that freedom of choice, and I think it's again when I look at what you've just mentioned around the freedom of choice, but equally that decentralized and centralized view, I then think about governments, because governments actually, I don't believe that governments have really equipped themselves properly with the use of data. I believe they're still 20 years behind. Private sector is moving way beyond some of the aspects of government. If you look at traditional governments around the world, bar probably Estonia, some departments in Singapore, you find that the digitization hasn't really taken effect. And I think that's the worrying aspect of governments now. And that's why I think they're lagging to actually implement to go back to Ulrich's point at the front lines, to implement the data products that the civil servants need in order to do their jobs effectively. And I think that's one thing that is hugely missing in government, where we're still using very old processes in a new age where we're all traditionally on smartphones and so on, and I'm still having to fill in forms in order to give it to a government department, which is absolutely ludicrous. So, government needs to step up in a way that, walk the walk. Writing a policy or talking about AI. Let's be frank. AI is nowhere here, right? We're not in true AI. It's artificially impossible at the moment to do that. There's probably a very narrow set of AI. Maybe my colleague from Google will tell me different. But we need to step away from that hype and that buzz. We need to go back to the practical reasons of why we're collecting that data, and that's the bit which governments are missing. They need to establish a base. They talk very well about it, but they don't actually implement it very well.
A noble call for governments to get off
They need to have a plan.
Yeah. And then, Gregor, I believe you also had some thoughts specifically about the role of regulation, jumping off of the discussion Samir was just having about governments and how they need to step up. What are your thoughts about sort of where we go and what's needed in relation to data?
I was coming from an insurance company. We do data since ever. Big data is not a concept that we don't know since years and years. So all of the actuarial parts that we are doing, all of the calculations, this is big data per se. What changed in between is rapidly changing is the willingness of sharing the personal data, which goes basically more generation-wise, and you can see it extremely. And second is the connectivity of the different data sources, which makes all of the game that we are doing in insurance completely different than before. When we come to resource of the future, it is different because now, in difference to past times, the access to this data is much broader than it was before. So basically the competition for me from all of the insurtech and the rest of the things gets to be bigger and bigger. So the business model has to be around these parts. And then comes actually to the techniques and to the ability of getting to use the data. Now, you can go on the extremely positive side, where it is one of the course of Generali strategies moving from pure insurance to prevention. And you can do from basic stuff like telematics, where a phone like this basically tells you how you drive and what is the probability of having an accident. It's not the speed, it's the how fast you brake, how much do you accelerate. It's simple things. It's really not, this is not artificial intelligence by far. It is something that actually is something that children can do. That you can use as a simple prevention, simply through the discounts, through the actions, through the stuff. You can move further on from what we are doing in Vitality in some of the markets, and we will enlarge, is about how you try to steer the people to live healthier, because actually your phone traces quite a lot of your lifestyle, which a lot of people are simply maybe our generation is not really used to this stuff, but the young generation easily shares the data about their lifestyles and also has no problem of using this data if they get something in exchange. But this word is there. And I think then we come to the real problem or the challenge that the regulators and the industry has once we start to move to the places like medical data and the rest of the things. There must be a line of regulation, it's clear. But where to put the line, I think, is the huge challenge that you're having. So if you put it too much on the regulatory side, you'll be simply limiting the ability of a country, union, or whatever to compete against the rest of the world, taking Asia being completely liberal on these parts of the business. If you put it too low, yes, there will be always challengers that maybe are using the data, and you can come to a problem that you have a part of the population that will simply in our business not be able to be insured. So, and this is the challenge that is really coming. It is not about technology. Technology will be there, technology is there, and technology is simply just the way how to use it is the challenge. So this we will not go away from. The real putting the line between being regulated or being basically really putting the business down is the real stuff that is coming in the future.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying, just to summarize, please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, that one of the most important things is to ensure that regulation is not such that innovation is harmed and that organizations from specific countries aren't able to compete on the global stage, but also to be aware of what types of data do in fact need stronger regulation and perhaps maybe regulations from the government and so on, because it is so vital and so fundamental to privacy. And Levente, as you work with Google, could you perhaps speak about how Google approaches this idea of data sharing and regulation in relation with the government, how they work together, and sort of also what you see as the primary needs, or perhaps Google sees as the primary needs in order to ensure that data does benefit society?
Thank you. Yes, I think data sharing is central to that. I'm not exactly sure how that interacts with government-led initiatives, although I do want to pick up on a previous point made regarding the readiness or lack thereof of governments or countries in the region in the digital transformation. And I just want to put one great example out there, because I think it's necessary to give credit where credit is due and try to encourage similar solutions to take hold elsewhere. I understand that Slovenia is, for example, running a joint e-procurement platform with Slovakia and I think it is Croatia, which I think is a terrific, it's a simple idea, it's a terrific idea, it is an efficient idea. And there are a number of other good initiatives in the region. So I think it is also perhaps time to reconsider what is possible in Central and Eastern Europe when it comes to digitization. But I'm not one to talk for the public sector. When it comes to data sharing, yes, I think that is fundamental here. Google has been committed to open data since its foundation. It was part of the culture of the engineers that have essentially set up this company. We open up a variety of our high-quality data sets, both to benefit research or the startup community. The open image data set is perhaps a good example. Waymo, our sister company, has released just 2 days ago, I think 10,000 driving segments, which I think many people are interested in the mobility space, I'm too. 20-second videos shot at 200,000 frames per second, and when it comes to big data, which the previous question was about, I think there's an increasing focus on smaller but higher quality data sets, because actually curating, cleaning, annotating data that is a tough job. But making readily available larger data sets that are already pre-selected, annotated, can benefit science or research and innovation quite a bit. We also believe a lot in the value on data portability or data mobility. We created the Takeout tool, Google Takeout tool, where you can take out your data automatically. In 2011, I think 20 million people are using it annually. And we're also working with, which is another good example of I think, a cross-industry cooperation with Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and Twitter to create what is called a data transport project or protocol, which would be an open source platform where two service providers could connect, of course, at the initiative of the user, and seamlessly transfer the chunk of user data from one service to the other, again, to the benefit of innovation and to the user. We have no interest in creating, I don't know, walled gardens. We believe in good products that are used for, because they deliver that value. So that is our take on that. I'm sure it's not a full answer, but I think open data and data sharing is central to that discussion.
And I have follow-up questions, but I wanted to ask, did any of the panelists have a response or anything that you wanted to contribute to? Yes, Commissioner.
Just briefly, I entirely agree on this balance between good and bad actors. The 90% of the people who are engaged in what we've been discussing have only the very best motives and are trying to do everything they can, in some cases to sell their products, but to do something socially useful. The problem is the disproportionate effect of a small number of bad actors, and that's why we have to worry about it and deal with it. I entirely agree on the importance of public-private sector cooperation, and I agree that the government sometimes, and the public sector in general, has quite a lot of catching up to do. The private sector also has to play its role in building trust in areas where questions have been asked. So on openness to external scrutiny, there is a problem, for example, in the fight against disinformation, because it is quite difficult to be open about how the algorithms are working in the distribution of news feed, and yet there's a real call for that openness to independent scrutiny. So there are some issues where we are going to have to continue the debate in order to build trust and empower individuals to get the information that they seek. And lastly, on regulation, again, I don't think anyone should be reaching quickly or automatically for regulation, but there will be some areas where the issue comes up because there are different practices and different traditions, and there are different social norms in different parts of the world. So there are things going on, for example, in China, around the use of data, both its collection and its use, that I think make many people in Europe, for example, uncomfortable. And so there is no, at the moment, easily manageable global approach to, for example, unconsented mass observation, or, for example, social scoring mechanisms. So we have to face up to that. And we have to find some way of managing a world in which some stuff is okay in some parts of the world and not okay in other parts of the world. And that means that we have to have some sort of rules and some sort of transparency about how data is collected, how it is used, and how the algorithms that are derived and used in one place might or might not be used in another place.
Yes.
I would like to reflect on that because from our point of view, like infrastructure company having a lot of view on different parts of businesses, partly we have a very good view on what's going on in the private sector, what are the companies doing on the competitive markets. What we see and what we feel is that, of course, competitiveness between private sector, let's say companies which are dealing with data, is forcing to do some barriers between things which are good for the society, to be clear. Yeah? So in this regard, what we see is that sometimes the companies running in a public sector could contribute into the benefits of society in a much better way than the private sector. But the point here is actually to find the right way to break all these barriers. Because if we just keep data in one central point, if we allow Amazon or Google or anyone to have this data, algorithms and everything inside, and not being willing to accept some advice from the authorities which have an even better view than them on particular business, this might be an issue for the future of our society. And here, I think the main challenge, of course, is how to deal with IP, with intellectual property, how to bring these collaborative projects which at the end will benefit for everyone. And I have to be honest, our company is very pushy on that subject. We try to open new projects. We are crossing the border, the boundaries. We're trying to go also to the businesses which are not the core business of our, let's say, legislative framework. But that should be one of the challenges, I think, which everybody should work on.
Yes. So it's basically, to what you said, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but to work out what those shared data standards are going to be, where data sharing comes in to ensure that there aren't monopolies and sort of, yes, of course. Go ahead, please.
I think we're missing a point, though. We're missing the point where we've got, to go back to your point, Uroš, private sector and the public sector, and there needs to be a combination of the two in order to enhance the way that we share data, that we are transparent with data. But I think we've got another part of that, a triumvirate, which is civil society, which I think we're missing out here, because civil society, if you look at what's happening in Hong Kong now, I think we've got to really understand how governments, and let's face it, in the future, 2040, if we cast a view out into 2030, 2040, I think governments are going to be boundaryless. I think there's going to be a huge amount of civil exchange and civil projects, and the coming together of people who want to drive government in a different way. And I think that's where civil society needs to go. And we're not actually stepping up in that way. So we're assuming that somebody will fix the issue. We're assuming that Google will come and rescue us, or that the government sector will come and give us a hug and make sure that we're okay. But that's not true. I think civil society has to take responsibility as well. We talk about AI, we talk about algorithms, we look at bias, we look at transparency. Bias is a fundamental aspect of the algorithms that we're working with now. If I program something for civil society, have to put my own bias in there. How if I'm making a product for the citizens of a country, am I going to be audited on that? Am I going to be transparent about an algorithm that's been created? It could be a civil society organization that is going to adopt a practice and say that we will actually lay down a particular policy or something. So I think we've really got to get out of this thing that governments are always going to get us out of stuff. And it's important as citizens that we really do take that responsibility back, because we've just given it away.
Which I think raises another question, or notable point anyway, which is this education. I don't know how much the average individual is really aware of what data is, of what big data is, of how it functions, of how it's used. And so to your point, it's a critical part of being able to act is first ensuring that people are just baseline educated. I'm sorry, and I started to interrupt really quick, but unfortunately the commissioner has to step out because of other obligations. So he's going to do so now. Do you have any final points you wanted to make before you?
You give me a ring and tell me what the answer is.
And then Gestemir, if you wanted to continue.
So it just goes back to your point around how we understand data. I'm a part of an organization called the Global Data Literacy Project. And there was a pretty stark survey that was done last year for 8,000 worldwide organizations, top 500 FTSE companies. And out of that, only 24% of the executives in those companies are actually data literate. So if we look at the executives who are using data supposedly on a day-to-day basis, and then on the flip side, the next generation coming up, the 16 to 24-year-olds, equally are only 23% data literate. We've got a really huge, big problem, because the idea of data literacy is how we read, argue, interpret, and analyze data. And as citizens and as people in companies, we need to understand that we're not very good at it. And the highest, actually, what was really interesting, the highest rate of data illiteracy in organizations is in the finance department. 90 to 95% of the finance departments in private sector organizations, and probably public sector as well, I would imagine, are data illiterate. So we've got some really big hills to climb. I'm just looking at the castle and thinking, wow, that's a big hill there. But I think, we've got major fundamentals to get over. That divide is only getting more and more because there's only a very small section of society that actually understands what to do with data. So I think that's an important factor that we have to think about. Back to the education point.
Right, yes. Does anyone have any comment that they wanted to make in response?
It's not just about the data literacy. I think it's a lot of other stuff that has to be also put it into the educational system. It's about pure financial products literacy. If you take how everybody knows that there is a cooking course in the school, you don't find a lot of financial literacy courses in the primary and secondary schools. So there is a lot of knowledge that has to be redone because simply the world is changing with a pace that is completely different than before. This is the reality.
Before we move on to
I think on the specific subject of data literacy or data education, not so much, but I'm happy to expand the topic a little bit to the larger question of digital education and digital skills, because I think that is one of the key enablers that we need to get right to realize the vision that we might have for our region or for our countries or for our communities to narrow down the digital divide. That is another topic on its own. And that is also one area where we try to do our fair share. We have a multi-annual program in Europe which is called Grow with Google. There's a stand outside if anybody's interested in the details, where we offer free digital education on a product agnostic basis to a number of groups of societies. So I think that is one of the main areas where we need to keep focused. As private companies, NGOs, we work with a number of NGOs that help us, or actually we help them to deliver their training. So I think the larger set of digital education is the more critical issue. Of course, data education and I don't know in higher education, right, at universities, that is also very important because this transformation will create a number of new jobs, and some jobs will also decline, but I think that is our perspective on that.
So it sounds like there's basically a consensus across the panel that one of the major things we need to ensure that data does benefit society is to have an active and engaged public that is informed when it comes to basic data science and computer science skills, basic technological comprehension, and so then education is really sort of the root of where we largely begin. Sorry, excuse me. So now we are going to turn to the Q&A portion of the event. There's a lot of stuff that we covered, so there's still a lot more that's left to be said. But again, we want this conversation to extend beyond just the panelists here and to answer your questions, get your thoughts and ideas and concerns. So does anyone have any questions for any of the panelists on any of the things that we touched on or something else entirely? Well, not entirely, generally data related, but... Not at all. We have data figured out. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Blaž Golub from Smart City Company. So I would like. Thank you, Blaž Golub from Smart City Company. I would like to ask a colleague from UK about. It was a huge initiative on smart cities in UK, and actually a lot of data was collected, and the question is, for example, was anytime because there were really some advanced solutions of smart city developments in UK, and the question is, was ever considered who owns the data on one side that is collected in the city, so about CO2 emissions, for example, or traffic. Not mentioning individual data, which is linked to the GDPR nowadays, but those data, it's a lot of data. Was any time a question who owns the data, and if it was a question like what kind of assets those data could be for the city in the future? Thank you.
It's a good question. And actually, at the moment, I think, I believe that I don't think London has done a very good job. In the first instance, I would say that we collect a huge amount of data. I think successive mayors have attempted to put in the smart city idea. There's a company called London and Partners that obviously works with technology companies in this area to bring together some change and different technologies that are applied across. What I don't think has happened actually is it's more the vision and the strategy of what you're going to do with that data, which is what's fallen down. That's my belief. I think most local governments or governments, and I know actually one thing around the city of Ljubljana as well, who's now embarking on a smart city project. And what I was disappointed about was the fact that they went straight for technology, which, again, you know, we know that across the panel we've agreed that technology is in abundance. But actually, if you don't have a vision or mission of what you're going to do with that data once it's collected, then I think you're going to fail. And I think we've seen that in London. I think we've seen very small uses of data, maybe to understand traffic patterns, maybe to apply that to the bus routing. I don't think we've done an extensive, hugely amazing work. And I think that's because of the technology first principles that we've always gone with. And that's what I see in Ljubljana now, which again, and I was part of those discussions at the beginning where, you know, there was the logic behind we want to do something, bringing together the waste, bringing together, you know, the traffic, bringing together all the other organizations, that the tertiary organizations that I call them, that would work into the local government and the city. But to come back to your point, I think the sharing of the data, the ownership of the data is always going to be an issue. If you look at corporates right now, even in corporates, nobody really owns data, which is quite phenomenal. I walk into organizations literally every day, and we talk about who owns data, and they scratch their heads like, "What do you mean? Why should I own that bit of data?" So I think it goes back to if I think about waste data, if I think about, you know, the water data, if I think about, you know, things that are coming out of that, yes, I believe that the entity should be owning it, should be owning that data, should be setting the standards within that, but working across, across the other organizations to come together to say, we all have responsibility for all of our data, but we also have responsibility for standards, we also have responsibility for governance, and we have a responsibility for innovation. And I think that's the issue that's cascaded from the private sector into the public sector. This whole siloed mentality on the ownership of data is endemic in every single sphere in public and private. So it's I believe you've got to set some rules, you've got to set some capability and skills. The thing that lacks in most of the public sector, and actually private sector as well, I'm going to talk about those two synonymously, is actually the skills of implementing such advances, such innovation. Because people don't treat data, to your point, as an asset. They don't look at it as an asset. Somebody said, in our company, we know how much furniture we have, we know where it all is, but we have no idea of where our data is. We have no asset, we have no inventory of our data. So think about that. That's an insurance company. That was a CIO from an insurance company. So we've got really big issues, but I think the ownership has to stay resident with those people who own that data, but they have to be able to exchange it in a way that is seamless, structured, and there's rules based around it, and that's where the issue comes with putting technology in first. So the governance behind data is a massive thing that needs to be dealt with on the first part of it. That vision and mission needs to be dealt with, and then you can enhance, you know, the citizens' lives. You can do whatever you need to do with data. Hopefully that's kind of giving you some perspective. Yeah.
Just maybe to add on it, personally I think that the whole game of data ownership as advantage in business is by far not done yet. I think this is the game of the markets in the next 5, 6, 7 years. It goes together with ecosystems. Those ecosystems are going to be logically something that will be advantage, and especially what is the place of your company in the ecosystem is going to define how big your margin is in the future. And this ecosystem is built around data, is built about connectivity of the data, is built about who owns the data, is built about who is moving the data left and right. Give a simple example in insurance, sorry.
Yeah, no, carry on.
Motor. Every car from next year on, from now on basically, but next year on, will have a full connectivity. So there is a black box inside. Everybody will know who is driving, how you're driving, when did you have the accident, how severe was the accident, everything. So who is going to be the one that's going to utilize this data? Is this going to buy, are you as a car manufacturer going to use this as a kind of limit the competition around, which becomes a huge, for me, competition problem on the markets? Are you going to sell this data for other services to get advantage on the market because you are better with the other ones? It is not about only insurance, it's about service, it's about leasing, it's about financing, it's about a lot of things. Same stuff is going on the medical side. If you take, in our business, there are probably two big ecosystems that are going on. One is about mobility, the second one is about medical and health. And these are the things that are, for me personally, is going to be played in the next 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years. But it's going to influence a lot of things. If regulatory part does not simply break it in a sense that can be either positive or negative, and this is the challenge that is around.
Just one point on that. I actually take again, I'll bring up Estonia to the point where I think in terms of e-government, in terms of interoperability of data across different departments of government and different, within, say for example, law enforcement and then the private sector, that is an amazing case study on how those three come together in such a way. And take the insurance example. The ownership of data stems with an individual. And here's where it's really interesting. A guy drives up to a garage to check his car in for a checkup, a service or whatever it might be. That data is transferred into a portal because that person is given the exchange that when they go to get new insurance or they go and buy a new car or they check a new car that they're buying, everything is within that platform. So if I go into a garage and if I go to somebody, say for example I go and buy a car from you, I can check instantly whether your car has been in an accident, whether you fixed it, and whether you're telling the truth about that car. Isn't that amazing that you can do that? And I can see different aspects of how many fines you've had on that car, if there's any outstanding. So there is a process of embedding data from every single source, be it law enforcement, government, insurance companies, and that, again, and civil society. So that coming together is quite fantastic. So why can't other governments do that? What are we waiting for? You know, case studies are out there. Why are we stopping in order to say, oh, we can't do this because somebody doesn't like that? But if I was a citizen, I would be happy because I could see what happened to that particular car at some point, even though I don't drive anymore because I don't want to. You know, but I can see it's transparent. So that's the transparency of data, the exchange of data from a private citizen through to insurance company, through to a government and law enforcement. It's amazing. Sorry.
There is no single answer to all these issues, but maybe one aspect might help. I think data allows people to optimize things, and optimization is the core of improving efficiency. But there are simply elements where people don't want to accept higher efficiencies, and we have to take that into our substance, because Because if we look, I will move a bit from smart cities into smart grids. Smart grids can be based on different various efficient solutions. People will come to your house, build different appliances, but you will go to the point of increasing efficiency up to a certain level, and you will not be willing to go above that. And that's very probable cause and reason why people do not accept new tools, new applications, new stuff, because they don't feel it will help them, they don't feel that there is a real benefit for them in them, and they will just go away. And I think we have to cope with literacy also on these questions, because people need to know what is the benefit, if not for me, for the society, and for different aspects. But the core message from my side is, I think people have elements and reasons why they do not want to be more efficient on some particular points.
And just to piggyback off that, I think it is critical to read what we've been saying. Oh, sorry, yes.
On the current point, may I make a small point? Or would
yes,
you like
yes,
to go further?
yes,
Thank you. So there is one concept here that I wanted to offer another perspective on, and that is data ownership. You repeatedly brought that up. And I'm not an expert, for example, in the insurance field or some small verticals where there might be arguments in favor, but I think it's worth maybe looking at this. And so if we want to establish as a general rule, let's follow out the consistency of the argument, and we're not convinced that this is the right answer, that ownership would be the right answer to the woes of today of how data is used. Because if ownership is established, then value is established, and then market mechanisms would evolve on how to exchange data in exchange for direct financial, to actually sell it. If you want to.
I don't think it's direct selling of it. That's the thing. I think let's not paint the picture, and I think this is where people generally think that we use their data to monetize it and sell it. The value exchange of data can be very different. So I can exchange data that is produced, say, by an insurance company on credit scores to a retailer. And there is an exchange of value right there. I don't necessarily need to take a citizen's piece of data and sell that. So I think we've got to move away from monetization in a way that is bad. And that's where I think most people see monetization as they're just selling my data. Right. So let's look at it from a cost saving, which is from an internal perspective for private sector, or from a sharing, which could be between private and public, or citizen, and therefore and there is the revenue generation, absolutely, but that revenue generation may not be directly selling. It might be actually enhancing a product, like Google does.
Yeah, I think then we agree more than we don't. I
yes.
just wanted to caution against the possible vision that might seem attractive at first, but it contains many pitfalls, because if you, again, create ownership around small individual sets of data, that you create an incentive to sell it for those who are essentially in poorer economic conditions. Thereby you would make privacy essentially a luxury good, which you don't want to do, which we don't want to do. So I think when it comes to personal data and the handling thereof, we believe that the current framework that has been developed for, I don't know, more than a decade, if not two, which is about data protection, both in terms of privacy and security, is the right framework to handle this right. And not that we always got that right. I mean, there were privacy errors that we committed. I hope that maybe the majority opinion would be that we learned from that. But I think all I wanted to say is that it's an entirely different conversation to talk about ownership of, I guess, large data sets and individual data. There have been a couple studies, actually, that wanted to establish whether there is a market value for, I don't know, my data that I use or your data. And it found that, I mean, on an individual level, and in terms of the market value, it is close to worthless. Of course, my personal data for me is infinitely precious. This is why we need to safeguard it. But again, there is a mismatch, and it's easy to go off on a wrong tangent. And also some other, I don't know, researchers try to establish what is the value that is extracted from using services that are well ad supported, and thereby you contribute with your own data. And those figures are quite high. It can be in the tens of thousands of dollars if you just count, I don't know, word processors, navigation software that are essentially offered today by our firm and by others for free. And then you could have a discussion about the concept of what free constitutes. But I just wanted to stop here briefly so that I make sure that we understand each other. Thank you.
Now, I was just going to note that once again we came back to this idea of an informed public and having them understand how their data is used and how it actually operates, because, I mean, negative press does sell. I think we can all agree on that. The Google privacy issues, Cambridge Analytica is still in the press. It's probably never going to go away. And so counterbalancing that with an accurate depiction of the way that data can and is used for good for individuals is critical. Other questions? Yes.
Simon mentioned Estonia, and I agree, technically it's a great example, but two concerns. One is, what if someone doesn't want to participate in this system once it is established? Because it is up to you. It should be up to you as an individual. And the second one is, okay, even if you have data on when the car was serviced and so on, how do we know that data is actually accurate? Because it's when the data is generated, mistakes can happen, or a car accident is not the same as another car accident. How detailed that, okay, I might have a tiny little car accident and someone can look this up and say, okay, this car has been crashed, and I'll have problems selling my car. Whereas right now I can just keep on the invoices of when I serviced my car, and they can take my car to a garage and ask them to check. You can already get all the information about the car anyway. But my point is, what if those data that are somewhere in a database are actually accurate? And if they're not, how do we mend this? And if you don't want to be in the system once it is established for the whole country, how do you get out of it?
Oh, no, so basically it's just how to opt out, and then also how to ensure the accuracy of information, I
Sure.
believe is the question. Yeah.
And look, I absolutely advocate for the fact that there are some people who still want to be anonymous. I think we should have those rights. I believe that every person has the mandate to say what is right for them. So I think there is absolutely a value of somebody saying no. That's perfectly fine. I think that's within my rights as an individual of the world. On the second point, I think there's many ways to combat data quality. There's many ways to combat data issues. The integrity of data is what you're talking about. The fact that as an individual, I may not have keyed in something correctly, or if you're dependent on a human being, yes, things can go wrong. But then you have checks within the system that again, are fundamental to how you drive the quality of data. This is something that's been done for many, many years. It's not a new barrier that we've got to overcome. It's absolutely there right now. And we use things like robotic process automation now to actually clean a lot of the data that's very bad in systems. So there's ways of getting over that. I don't believe that that's an issue at all. I don't think that will... yes, you might have small anomalies, but what I want is data that's transparent. What I want is data that anybody can tap into. And if it is bad, if it is wrong, then it's incumbent on the individual to say that is wrong. Because again, I go back to responsibility of us. If it's my car and I was not in the accident, I'll give you an example. I often get these phone calls in the UK. I don't know if this happens in Europe. It annoys me so much. I get somebody calling me and saying, Mr. Sharma, were you in an accident yesterday? And I think, who is this? So somebody knows I was in an accident yesterday. I wasn't. I don't know if this happens. It's a stupid cold call. But essentially, if that data is there, if that data is transparent and it's available to everybody, I think there's a mechanism of us taking ownership of it and us being absolutely clear about what we want as individuals. So I don't mind the opt-out. I think that's very clear. We have those in GDPR. That is an absolute right of everybody. The right to be anonymous, the right to be erased, the right to, to a lot of data privacy. And we're going to see a lot more of that data privacy coming as well. We're seeing GDPR as a fundamental basis of being enacted across the world in continents like Africa, and in South America like Brazil, California, who's just adopted very GDPR principles. So I think that's absolutely fine. I don't have a problem with it. But I think, the quality issue, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. I think that can be dealt with, absolutely.
Yeah, I also think on the matter of the opt-out, I've said before that I think the industry has maybe not done a good enough job of explaining of what tools are already at the disposal of the individual users to control how their data is used. So let me take this opportunity to do that very quickly. That option is out there for all of our services. If you go to your account, Google account, you can opt out of targeted advertising, for example. You can use Chrome in incognito mode. So again, some people may not know, but these options are out there. It is our belief, it is my belief that these services deliver the value that would make this sort of transfer a fair one. I prefer to, I don't know, if I search for coffee, I prefer to search to show me the nearest coffee houses or not an article about the history of coffee, right? But for that, it needs to know where I am. So location history needs to be, or location needs to be enabled. And on the wider issue of GDPR and privacy regulation, yes, that is something we also would support. So comprehensive privacy legislation that establishes a baseline across a larger area and jurisdiction would, of course, benefit us, because the Commission is no longer here, but he made the point of how there might be different regulatory standards developed in different jurisdictions of the world. Well, now, for a global company or even a regional one, that is a very delicate dance to dance, right? Should we? And we have, of course, implemented right to be forgotten quite quickly, but one of the I think fascinating dilemmas, or even I think a legal case, was that so should we, for example, comply with the lèse-majesté laws of Thailand, right? Which is an extremely narrow understanding of what sort of data, what sort of information we should take off in that jurisdiction from search. But then would the same, so should we apply the same standards then globally, right? So this is why we would support an emergence of over time, perhaps even a global set of standards that would establish a baseline that essentially makes it a little bit easier to comply with, and also educate users about what is possible and what is not. But point being, you can opt out if you want.
Also, can you speak perhaps a little bit, and if you can't, that's fine, but about how effective that is? So, for example, if there's like a do not track, can we be sure, like, is there a set standard so that companies, organizations, websites know what to do when they receive that? Or is that kind of just sort of up to the individual organizations and websites and so on to respect that, or how that plays into this?
I'm not a technical expert by any means. I think this specific example of the do not track request, maybe there are panelists on here that know better, is actually just a request you send, and the website may or may not respond to that favorably. So that is where actually the hands of the developer of the browser are tied. But that is, of course, again, not concerning our products. In our products, you opt out, and then history of coffee article instead of coffee houses that are close to you. It's a choice for everybody to make.
Other questions that we had from the audience? Yes.
Thank you very much for this nice discussion. I'm a professor at the University of Trieste nearby here. Talking about data, my very high concern is about cybersecurity. This has been pointed out clearly at the World Economic Forum in Davos this year. Cybersecurity is one of the most, let's say, important risks, both in terms of impact and in terms of likelihood. And this is going to be even more and more relevant when we will start to collect human health data. This is going to happen in a few years from now. You all know Internet of Things. You probably not many people is aware about the Internet of Nano Things, which is something really disrupting, because we're going to have nano machines collecting data inside the human body, transferring this data to the wearable technologies, acting as a sort of a gateway, and send this data, which will be located, of course, and controlled through the air. 5G, for example. Certainly non-internet. So the question is, what do you think? Are we going to rely on a software tool for security? Or perhaps hardware? Or perhaps, I don't know, quantum network technology, where we do not rely anymore on impulses, but we rely on packets? So that's the question, and I think we have to find a solution as soon as possible. Otherwise, the Internet of Nano-Thing market will stop. Thank you.
Does anyone have any comments on cybersecurity or?
I can start. I'll be relatively easy on it. Yes, cybersecurity is probably one of the biggest risks coming, and I don't even think about the nano part. IoT is a risk enough. So IoT, if you take again connected cars, you know what can happen if somebody breaks into the system and makes a real mess on the streets of a city. So cyber risk is a huge, huge thing for the future. I think it's something that from purely insurance industry perspective is a risk that has a huge magnitude. So it's not a high frequency risk, it's probably a risk with low frequency and extremely high magnitude. And especially for these kinds of risk, if I take it purely business side, pricing such kinds of risk is extremely, extremely hard. So I think we are currently, the whole industry, trying to get some kind of models, ideas, statistics, because the first things are happening is maybe not in IT space, but purely on the data space and data stealing. That we try to somehow apply this for the future, but is still by far not the case. I think the biggest challenge will be simply to be technologically more advanced than the people that are trying to use it, which is a paradigm in itself. So I sorely don't have an answer for this one.
Yeah, from the infrastructure point of view, you can imagine how many risks lie behind this question. We have a lot of policies related to critical infrastructure protection, which also touches the question of cybersecurity. So what we have changed dramatically in the past 5 years is that we do not really look only into the cyber world, but we try to look in security issues from a holistic point of view, because you can be attacked by really different ways and means today, from drones to whatever kind of things you can imagine, and you need to have a policy strategy on the wider level. Of course, if we talk only about cybersecurity, there was time in the past when this very critical infrastructure was closed and the system were just isolated, but this also turned not to be the good strategy, because now we need new data to come to fit in the optimization algorithms and all that stuff. So I think if I can put it simple, we have to be very holistic on that, and we have to really take into consideration various aspects, talking to the police, talking to different strategies, and actually my company is quite strong also on that part, and I'm very proud of that.
So I'll just give my 2 cents. I don't think much has changed. In 1997, I wrote a thesis on information warfare, and that really described the importance of data and information and how it could be disrupted to be used as a bad mechanism to destabilize governments, to destabilize infrastructure. I don't think we've even moved from 97 to anywhere different that we are now. And the conversations I have with people, at that time, I recall there being a study on the amount of times that the Pentagon had been hacked in 97, which was 250,000 times. So if you think about the Pentagon being hacked like that, then who knows what's happening behind the scenes for everybody else. So nanotechnology is not a new thing. I think nanotechnology has been around for quite a while. We just haven't talked about it in the way that we are now. And I talked about it back then, about how we would have devices that are really small, that would be able to crawl into computers, that would be able to steal secrets, that would be able to do things that we would think is very James Bond-like-ish, but it absolutely can be done. So I think we talk about it a lot. We've just called it cyber warfare now. It's information warfare as far as InfoSec has been around for years, whether that's PSYOPs, whether that's HUMINT, whether that's the traditional mechanisms by which we have to think about security. If we don't look at it holistically, and I agree with Urosh, we will miss so much of what we actually have to, the data points that we have to look at. So I think wherever the bad actors are, they will still want to penetrate. They will be 10 steps ahead of us because they know how to do it better than governments, better than the private sector. But we need to have better security options in IoT. There needs to be better exchanges between those networks. The security updating on those is pretty bad. So the protocols have to be easier. You talk about packets, I think about DARPA, and that was World War II. That's how the internet began, packet distribution, so I get excited by that because that's kind of cool. But it was, happened in the 40s, which is quite amazing. But why are we still there? I don't, I wish I'd stayed in that industry and continued, but, I'm in a way and form that is within that. But I think nanotechnology and all of those and 5G are going to give us multiple security issues, but we have to be careful about the exchange of information between those protocols, the policy that we put in to ensure that, and again, I don't want it to be onerous policy because we could be hampered by policy if we wait for governments to do it. The private sector, again, it has to be a cooperation. It has to be a collaboration between so many different people coming together that we need to break down those barriers. And I don't think if I go out and talk to somebody to say, we want your health information because we're going to give you better services, people will run for the hills. And it's happening in the UK. It's been happening for a long time. And I'm sure in Europe it's been happening as well. This is nothing new. But actually, if we understood, if we got back to the education point as to why, if I'm in an accident, why does the hospital need to know about past injuries, blood type, other factors around my health? Because it's important. Nobody might be, why am I going to look for a piece of paper? So let's make sure we can do these things. So just going back to that whole thing, I think we've got to have those protocols in place. It is going to be a long tail. I don't think we're at that place now, but it's been going on for so long that I don't think people have really understood or talked about it in a way that has actually taken action.
Thank you. Just very briefly, my answer is not a systemic one. We were not invested in nanotechnologies, or not that I'm aware of. We remain a B2C company, but if I'm not mistaken, the weakest element in any cybersecurity system is the human element. We do secure, I think, one of, if not the largest infrastructure in the world in terms of data centers and cables, and I think luckily there were no large data breaches on the Google infrastructure. But what I want to make a point is that the weakest element is the human that accesses these systems, and we offer a number of tools that makes it easier to secure that access point. So I would encourage everyone, if they haven't, and if they use Google services, to do the privacy checkup. That is just a 10-minute questionnaire available on my account, which I think is google.account.com. It will surface any issues you might have. You might also want to use a password checker, which is a free extension into Chrome. Again, I'm assuming you're using Chrome sorry for that. It will automatically scan passwords you type into websites, and whenever you want to use the passwords twice, it will tell you not to do it. And there are a number of small little nudges that I think we are trying to put in place. Two-factor authentication. Again, this might be trite, but if you're not using two-factor authentication to secure your accounts, I would advise you to do it. Ever since Google has introduced two-factor authentication involving a physical key, so not just a text or a message-based second factor, I have it in my bag right there. Phishing attacks, there are successful phishing attacks conducted against the Google corporate accounts have dropped by 99%. I mean, effectively, there was no successful phishing attempt against a Google.com account since we have physical two-factor authentication. So there is a number of small steps that we can make as individuals to help contribute to the security to these huge systems that seem very distant and very, very large and very, the purview of us and, I don't know, and Microsoft and the other service providers. So I hope that was a useful 2 cents there.
And unfortunately, we're almost out of time. I think we came full circle once again in talking about the importance of education of individuals taking access and stepping up to be informed about the things that are available to them when it comes to protecting their own data, which on a larger scale, this education and sort of self-advocating and being informed is something that we desperately need in order to ensure that we have control of our data, we understand data, and that it actually does benefit us and society in general. Because, of course, if the coming generations aren't informed about data and how it operates and how it's used, where does that leave us? And then more broadly speaking, we spoke a lot about the importance of data sharing, of data not having data silos, of figuring out the ways in which data should be shared and the privacy and security that needs to be in place for specific types of data sets. So lots of questions still left, but I do feel like we at least have some headway on where we're headed and the important things we all need to keep in mind. So thank you all for coming. Again, please use the hashtag BSF2019, and if you haven't done so, get the app to connect with all of our wonderful panelists and speakers. Thank you.